So here's a common question that comes up a fair amount with things, and I see these rising pretty regularly, and which ones are popular or not seems to depend, but it's these personality assessments. And if you're not exactly sure what I'm talking about, I'll list off a few, and I think pretty quickly you'll be able to go, oh, yeah, I've done one of those. And what I'm talking about is like the Myers-Briggs assessment, MBTI, Strength Finders, DISC. Some people have done the color wheels. One of the other ones I'm hearing more and more about is the Enneagram. There's more of these personality assessments than I can count, and they're really designed to help people better understand who they are as an individual, with the goal ultimately of helping you better understand yourself, but also better understand others and how do you interact. It all sounds really well and good. And so the question is, are these things helpful or harmful? And let me tell you, over the years, as a learning leader who spent my whole career doing this, I have participated in, led, been part of, evaluated just about every single one of the personality assessments that are out there. And so my whole goal in this is not necessarily to give you, well, I'll let you wait till the end to see what my answer is on whether they're helpful or harmful. But let me break down things to consider both on the helpful and harmful, because there is some real things that you need to consider on both ends. So let's talk about the helpful piece, because the reality is there are some things that can be really helpful with these personality assessments. People are complex beings. We are multifaceted. There is a whole lot going on behind, emotions and mentally and all this different cognitive stuff that's happening. And these personality assessments can be helpful in understanding what I would call your instinctive behaviors. So, what I mean by that is when something happens, what just instinctually do you do? How do you respond to these different kinds of things? When you're in this situation, what is your go to for that? And that can be really helpful because a lot of times we don't think about this. We don't necessarily think about why we do the things we do. And these personality assessments can start to help us recognize some of this stuff that we just do without thinking. We just respond to people, we respond to situations in certain ways, and we don't even recognize it's happening. And so there is this self-awareness that can come from a personality assessment that helps you better understand, hey, this is the way I operate, this is the way I think about things, this is my go-to with stuff. And that can be really helpful for personal insight, things like that. The other thing I've seen come as a really helpful part of this is as you start going through this and understanding the different categories, because regardless of which one you take, there's a multitude of different personality categories. It does help open people's eyes to the fact that we do not all see the world through the same lens, which may sound really obvious when you hear it, but honestly, we don't, again, going back to just even personality assessments, a lot of times we don't think about that. And it's very easy to look at the world through our lens and assume everyone else is looking at it through the same lens. And so when we see people respond to the same situation differently, it can lead to us having a reaction or assuming that they don't understand or they're wrong, things like that. This is where we see some of this division. And so personality assessments can be really helpful in understanding, hey, here's how I process things. But you know what? Not everyone processes things like I do. And here are some of the different ways that people can process this stuff. And it's not good or bad, it's different. So that can be helpful. This, as an ultimate result, can be really helpful in helping us understand how to interact with people who don't see the world the same way we do. And I think this can be a really beneficial thing, because the reality is nobody who's watching or listening to this would ever, I don't think, say, I've never run into situations where I've had difficulty communicating or interacting with someone who wasn't exactly like me. That's challenging. And sometimes one of the easiest ways to work through that is to understand how they're processing the world, how they're seeing things, so that we can say, oh, okay, if that's how you're processing it, here's how we can find mutual ground. Here's how we can find some things. So again, going back to personality assessments, are there helpful attributes of them? Yes. And these three I think are the biggest three that I've seen that are really helpful. Okay. Now, there is a dark side to this, and that is the harmful side. And there is plenty of risk to be considered when you're considering a personality assessment. One of the biggest that I see is our personalities are not static. In interacting and focusing on human psychology and develop for my entire career, I have never seen a person respond exactly the same way, even to the same situation. And it's just because there are so many variables that affects things. The emotional state you're in, something that happened yesterday, the way you're feeling because of this or that. All these things lead to a lot of complexity into the way our personalities are formed. So while we may have tendencies, while we may have things that are our natural go-to by default, there is so much variation in that. And so whenever we take a personality assessment and we put somebody into this box, or we put ourselves in this box of this is how I respond or the way I am, it's a very dangerous place to be in. And what that can lead to is we can actually let these assessments drive our behavior instead of letting the assessments help us understand it. And what I mean by that is over the years, I have seen so many countless times where people have done these personality assessments, they get really attached to it, and suddenly they find themselves going, oh, I am this way because I'm a this. I have this tendency. So here's, and it justifies the behavior. So they actually behave almost intentionally because of what they believe their assessment has said about them. And this is really risky stuff because it it's not the natural way you're doing it. And so I've actually seen people paint themselves into a corner simply because an assessment that they took one day, which was based on how they were feeling that day or their initial reaction here. And suddenly now they're making decisions, they're interacting with people, they're making assumptions about themselves and others purely based on this snapshot of how they were feeling or what was going on in that moment. And again, personalities are not static. We change stages of life. I mean, there are so many variables that are changing. And this to me is one of the biggest risks is that not only you can paint yourself in a box that is far too static and end up actually rooting your identity into this thing. I am a this. No, you're not. No, you're not. And actually, whenever I've had to be involved in these, this is one of the biggest things I always push on them is don't let your identity become tied to this personality assessment. This is nothing more than a helpful indicator of how you may be processing, how you may interact with things. So I think those two really are very tightly interconnected and a very serious risk that I commonly see associated with personality assessments. The other ones that I would say, the other one I'll focus on, because I could probably talk about this for much longer than I will in a short video, but is the biases that we can end up putting on. I mentioned some of those things we do to ourselves, but I've also seen bias just wreak havoc in teams when they use personality assessments. Oh, you're a that. And again, it goes back to this in the helpful piece. One of the things you're always trying to do is make sure people understand that, hey, one is not good or bad. Neither is better or worse than the other. But inevitably, people just tend to position theirs, oftentimes position theirs as better. And so suddenly they start biasing towards other personalities. Oh, you're a that. And again, remember, your personality is not, if your personality is not static, neither is the other person's. So these biases you're placing on other people when you go, oh, I remember working with one company, they actually put the MBTI thing on people's badges for a period of time. And it was a disaster because people just started going, oh, you're that. I'm just going to treat you based on the stereotype associated with this, which is something we're trying to root out of organizations all the time. So this is a serious risk associated with this. So all that to say, okay, I hopefully this has highlighted at a very quick level some of the high level risks and benefits that you should be thinking deeply about if you're considering a personality assessment. But where does that then land on? So what do we do? Should we use them? Are they helpful or harmful? The answer is yes, they're both. And so should we use them? It depends. And what I would say is how you use them, the expectations you set with them are going to be almost more important than the personality assessment itself, because in the wrong hands or set up incorrectly, this can be disastrous. And so, with that, I would say if you're using it, where I've found the most benefit is used personally for some self identification, some ways of trying to better understand the way you process information, the way you handle situations, as long as it doesn't creep into this is who I am, as more this just initial first pass of, hey, this is helping me get some self awareness of maybe things I'm not aware of, some initial reactions, some behaviors that I might want to watch out for, tendencies that I may do, and help me better understand how I may interact with other people. Where I see it start to cross the lines of the harm outweighs the good is when it started to be done with a group. Inevitably, the biases, the assumptions, it's hard enough to get people to manage this well individually. Having them do it individually and collectively, almost universally, I will say, has far more damage than good. So, inevitably, would I say people should do them? I don't know that I personally would ever advocate. Honestly, I've seen far more damage done with them. I think there are better ways to assess who you are as an individual and some of your behaviors and tendencies. I think there are safer ways that you can engage with it. That to say, I wouldn't completely write them off and say, hey, stay clear of these things, never go near them. I think they can add some real value, but you really have to touch these things with, a radioactive suit, because there is some real inherent risk associated with it. And this risk is often not addressed. If you look at a lot of these personality assessments, they may lightly address some of these things, but a lot of times they don't go into the real depth of how serious of a thing this can be and how much risk is associated with it. So there you go. Hopefully you found that helpful, and I hope you have a great one.